We're really lucky to have Manesh here with us today. We connected a couple of months ago at a conference at UCSD, and he is a neuroscientist, a science communicator, and as probably lots of you watching already know, a leading voice in psychedelic research. He is the co-founder and CEO of Five Discovery and a scientific director of the Center for Minds. And his work bridges cutting edge brain science with the transformative potential of psychedelics to explore new frontiers in mental health, brain health, and human flourishing. So, thank you for joining us today.
Awesome. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So, I want to start us off kind of broad. We're going to be talking about psychedelics and relationships. And I think something that would be really helpful for our viewers is to know a little bit more about what's happening in the brain. So, when couples are coming to us for couple therapy, or when couples are experiencing distress in their relationships, they typically have very rigid thought patterns. So, things like, my partner's hurting me on purpose, they're never going to change, it's going to be like this forever. They have a lot of difficulty moving into difficult emotions. So things like sadness or fear. And then we often see them stuck in behavioral patterns, right? So in conflict, they get really reactive or they shut down and they avoid. So if you were talking to someone who didn't know much about the brain or psychedelics, how would you explain how psychedelics can be helpful at kind of shifting some of these places? So what is actually happening in the brain to help shift things that are happening with our thoughts, moving into emotions, or potentially shifting some of these behavioral patterns?
Yeah, this is great. At a high level, one of the perspectives that's very common in psychedelic neuroscience is this idea that psychedelics kind of unconstrain the brain. It allows the brain to escape its usual grooves and enter into new patterns, and that's conducive to insight and new perspectives and all this. And to go a bit deeper on that, it's thought to be related to the serotonin 2A receptor particularly. And when you activate this receptor, it's not like it only affects a single part of the brain. It really just changes how your brain as a whole functions and how it processes information. And one of the main areas that's often talked about is the default mode network, which is by no means the only network affected, or maybe not even the most important, but it is a network very much related to our internal narrative, our dialogue, our conceptual thinking, and also how we conceptualize other people and the models we create of others, which is called theory of mind or mentalizing. So all these things are related to the default mode network, which is disrupted in its connectivity with itself and with other networks. And so the idea is these grooves that people inhabit in terms of relational patterns and patterns of emotional avoidance and these kinds of things are encoded in these networks, which are then perturbed temporarily under a psychedelic. And this can allow things to open up, allow new perspectives, allow one to see perhaps how, the blame that we're giving to somebody or what we're attributing to somebody else, is not really what we're seeing. We're seeing an incomplete picture, or it can lead to taking more ownership in ourselves. And so I think these brain effects of just loosening up things that, loosening up the rigidity that we get stuck in can be really insightful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so kind of what you're describing is like our brains have a very specific way of functioning, and psychedelics kind of like shake that up temporarily so we can start to develop some of these new perspectives or ways of functioning.
Yeah, that's the general through line, and I think we can go deeper into it. There's a variety of ways to go deeper into that. One is that, when often, I mean, in my experience, let's start with that. I mean, when there's a lot of blame and like, oh, they're doing this and they're doing this to me, and there's a lot of kind of an offloading of responsibility and a blame and a tendency to blame and get stuck in these narratives of resentment and victimizing and
Mm-hmm.
perpetrator-victim dynamic, all these things. It's often something that we're reifying by thinking about it over and over again. And often it's also an avoidance of difficult emotion in ourselves. And
Yeah.
so, it's a lot of times the way through that is acknowledging like I'm sovereign over my experience. I'm having this emotional experience. I'm projecting it outwards, but I have to also take ownership that I'm having this and, obviously look into my contributions to it as well. And I think psychedelics, by shaking us out of our usual frame, also kind of break down our emotional armoring and our resistance and make these emotions harder to avoid. So then, whatever is underlying that tendency to blame and project, you're going to have to face that. You're very likely going to have to face that. And then it's about integrating and holding that experience and allowing it to shift how you're viewing the other person. And often, psychedelics can really humble us, right? They could bring us to
Yeah.
our knees. We could think we're a really grounded, solid person, but then we're, crying on the ground or whatever in a psychedelic journey. And I think, humility, I'm sure you guys are very well aware, is like the main currency of connection and vulnerability is humility, being able to,
Mhm.
admit that you were hurt or that you feel this way and taking ownership instead of putting it on the other. And so I think psychedelics, by loosening up our rigid frameworks and our defensive armoring and allowing these things to come out, are just conducive to that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, there seems
Yeah.
to be this like really powerful capacity. I mean, I'm most familiar with this in the MDMA work that we've done in kind of a research context, which is for the generally for the purpose of treating PTSD and the ways in which I've worked with it. And one of the ways in which we think that it helps with PTSD is it sort of increases our capacity, right, to make contact with these painful emotions that are in there and that are driving our behaviors in ways that we're not necessarily conscious aware of. And for folks with PTSD, sometimes in our sort of ordinary state of consciousness, it feels too overwhelming, too painful, too intense, right, to make contact with some of those feelings. And we see this show up, in relationship dynamics too. I'm really identifying with what you're saying here about like, I need to be aware of my own vulnerable emotional reactions and the way that those are underlying my behaviors in the relationship, right? And sometimes couples get so caught up in what are you doing and what am I doing that we forget to tune into, how am I showing up in a way that's actually about how I'm feeling, not so much about what you're doing, right? It's about my attempt to cope
Exactly.
with the pain that I
Mhm.
experience or the challenging emotions of vulnerability that I experience. And there's something about psychedelics that just allow us to get to that space, that heart space, right? However we want to think about it, that place where we can be aware of and be with those feelings instead of being sort of flooded by them.
I'm thinking about like often,
Hmm.
so obviously
Totally.
we have people coming to do therapy as a couple, but we in our practice also have individuals that come to do some sort of relational work. I'm thinking about a man that I just started with, and like we just had our first session, and all of it is about what his partner is doing to him and how he is a victim in this. And even just asking the question of like, what is her experience? What has she shared with you about her experience about why she's unhappy? And he's like, she has no reason to be unhappy. I'm like, oh, okay. Like, we're going to have to dive. I can't do anything to shift her, right? Our work is going to be with you. And we're going to have to get to a place where we can be vulnerable and self reflect in order to do anything, in order to make any changes in your life. And the wonderful experience of technology.
Oh, so delightful. Gotta love Wi-Fi.
Yeah, I think what he was saying about just like this humbling experience,
Uh-huh.
I think that, yeah, that's not something that we I mean, it's not something that I talk a lot about with people in integration, and like I think we see it more with like psilocybin or
Mm.
DMT,
Mm-hmm.
where it's like you are just brought to your knees by the experience.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, it really forces you to reflect on like who am I and how am I showing up in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I don't usually use the word humility or like use that as a construct in relational work, but that is what we're talking about. We are talking about, can you get your ego out of the way and have a little bit of humility about your own personal human experience and vulnerabilities, and what would it be like to actually show up with that in your
Mm-hmm.
relationships. I
Mm-hmm.
like that concept.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, you just touched on something that we can. Oh,
Hey,
hello.
I'm back. Sorry about that. Don't know what
that's right.
happened. I think I should be okay now.
No
You
worries.
actually are a little clearer now.
Okay, great, perfect.
We were just
um,
talking about Chandra and I don't typically think about our work in terms of humility, in terms of helping
Mm.
people connect with their own personal humility, but that is what we're doing. And that's like such a
Hmm.
relevant and powerful concept. So I really like being able to think about it in that way.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah.
yeah, it was just making me think about like this concept of ego dissolution. And I think that that kind of connects to humility. So maybe you could talk a little bit about like what is ego dissolution and why does this happen?
Yeah, for sure. And so this is a very common, well, not very common, but very commonly talked about, we could say that, effect of psychedelics that has been linked to therapeutic outcomes with depression, with anxiety, with substance use. And like so on the psychological level, it's the experience of, well, there's two components. Let's do it this way. One is losing a sense of where your body is in space and often blending with what's around you and not knowing, where the couch ends and you begin, or, emerging with people in your environment and nature. And then there's the aspect of losing a sense of our individual identity in terms of our stories, our narratives, our ego. And so we're just in this place where spatially we're everything and nothing, and we don't know necessarily who we are conceptually. Our labels and constructs are gone. And so we're just kind of this free floating awareness that's one with all things. And that kind of unitive, connective state is the flip side of ego dissolution. Because ego dissolves, then unity comes in to replace it as our experience. And this can be a fascinating experience, right, to say the least, because most people don't have a sense of existing without a sense of who they are, right, their identity. And we assume naturally that our identity is a core part of our experience and it can't go away. It's like, how can I experience something without being an experiencer having it? But these profound experiences do happen. And of course, there's a long history of them in meditative traditions, yoga, and all sorts of things. And in the brain, we don't fully understand how this is happening, but it's likely multiple things at once. One, relating perhaps to a disruption or alteration of regions related to memory, including in the default mode network. Our hippocampus, for example, in our brain is something that contextualizes our experiences and who we are in terms of other factors or like our past, present, future. And there's evidence of disruptions to your hippocampus and how it connects to the rest of the brain, which might relate to that aspect. In addition, there's regions such as the insula, or what's called the temporal-parietal junction, which are basically about integrating our bodily felt experience, kind of a somatic awareness, with our spatial sense of where we are in space. And these regions also get disrupted. So basically, put that all together. It's like our location in space and in a body with this story. This is going out the window, and maybe to tie it back to what we're talking about, it could just show us how imprisoning our internal narratives and identity structures can be, and how heavy they can be. Because when they're gone, I could speak from my own experience with 5-MeO-DMT, that entering into these ego dissolution states, when your ego starts to boot up back online like an operating system, you realize just how heavy and dense it is and how just unnecessary a lot of that is. And there's this kind of vibrant intelligence that emerges when our mind is still. I think psychedelics can put us in touch with that. And therefore allow us to like live in a way where our stories and judgments and all of our concepts are held more lightly. We just don't immediately identify with them or take them as as like indisputable fact.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that experience with a partner, both like merging after disillusion or like merging together through the psychedelic experience. So I have experienced both and I've heard couples talk about both. So, what, maybe Kayla, you can talk about this. Like, what impact does that have, like disappearing or kind of merging together during a psychedelic experience?
Yeah, it's funny. I recently had a ketamine journey with a partner where we had that exact experience where we sort of like melded and unmelded, and it was cool. Um, I think, like, at the end of the day, a lot of what any kind of psychological work is trying to do is to remind us that we are not alone in existence, right? Like that we are interconnected with others and with the world around us and with the universe, right? To whatever extent people feel that. And so, so much of what we're trying to do is just not be alone in this existence, right? And I think, having having a very visceral experience of like the boundaries of my identity being softened or disappearing, dissolving away, and being able to really feel that connection to other people. This is a big part of what so many people take away from psychedelics, right? And I think is a lot of what we want to do in partnership with people is figure out how to live in a way that is like interconnected with somebody else or with many somebody's else, and kind of hang on to that despite the fact that in our waking life, in our in our ordinary consciousness, we do have this sort of felt sense of like I am a separate person than you. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, when we're trying to think about how does this function in the world that we all live in our day-to-day lives, one thing that we talk a lot about with couples is like what does it mean to be interdependent in a way that's not like totally siloed, but also not like enmeshed, where I become you, you become me, we can't function, sort of independently. And so I think about this idea of like, what does it mean that like, we're all connected under the same fabric, and I'm kind of poking up over here and you're poking up over here, but the fabric that connects us is sort of the same. How can we be interdependent in that way? And I think psychedelics are a cool kind of playground for that, to explore that.
Yeah, if there's a way to have everyone do psychedelics and realize that we are all connected and
Put it in the
nothing
water
and
supply.
everything.
Just kidding. We would never.
Um, I'm just looking at my questions. So, thinking about like how long some of this openness lasts after a psychedelic experience, if we're thinking about these like neuroplasticity windows and couple therapy, um, what should we be doing and like for how long following a psychedelic experience? So I know the neuroplasticity windows are different depending on psychedelics. We use ketamine in our practice with couples. Um, and so if we're thinking about they have a medicine session together and then there's whatever the couple days after, what would we recommend to people to be doing during this period?
Yeah, it's really key. I think that especially the 48 hours, I think the critical period with ketamine is designated as 48 hours, at least in the rodent studies. And often people are still, not quite back in their center, right? And often being in your center implies that you're back in your patterns a lot of the time, right? Because then you're grounded. And it's often when you're ungrounded, then then your cracks begin to show and you start to reveal things. And so I think the 2 days after, people are still in this kind of afterglow experience. And especially if they're doing it together with their partner, that could be a very profound thing, different than anything they've ever experienced. And so capitalizing on that is important. And the thing with neuroplasticity, it's all about repetition and persistence, right? It's like, what fires together wires together. And so these new changes, these neuroplastic connections that ketamine can create will fade away if you're not engaging in behaviors consistently to maintain those new connections. And so really it's about making it concrete as well. So what I always recommend people is immediately after, as soon as you're able to, try to capture your experience, not in terms of like trying to capture every detail, but capture what was significant to you, what stood out, what was meaningful, what was particularly insightful. And go from that, like get that all out first as one step, and then try to derive concrete, actionable things that you can do. It could be like, oh, I'm gonna, check in with my partner about how they're feeling at 3 times a day or something, right? Or I'm gonna make sure I don't bring my phone to the dinner table, or it could be little things like that. Or it could be, oh, I'm gonna catch myself when I get into that familiar judgment cycle again, and catch it right at the beginning this time. And so I think making very concrete, specific behavioral changes, and then ideally tracking them, making them concrete. I'm a big, fan of measuring and tracking. Um, there's another quote relevant here, but I think I'm going to forget it. Something about, no, I'm not going to remember. It's just the point is that if you don't measure something, it's easy to lose track and fall off. And so, having a check-in with yourself at the end of the day or end of the week, how you did, that kind of thing, that kind of effort in an ongoing fashion is so critical. And a lot of people don't do it because we all know it's hard to take on new habits. We might have resistance to do it. You might be tired and like, oh, forget, I'll do it tomorrow. But it's like, no, you got to sit down and do it, every day. And that's how you make change. Making change is not easy. Psychedelics are not. And the biology supports this, right? You need that consistency and persistence, and you need the supports to make sure that you do it.
One thing that couples often ask me, or if I'm doing like an individual session and they're going back into the relationship, is like, what if I engage in the same patterns? Are they gonna, the old patterns, are they gonna be like more deeply ingrained during this neuroplastic window?
Yeah, I mean, the thing with neuroplasticity is that it's very neutral, and so it's really about what you do with it. And so
Yeah.
there's, no benefit that, I mean, no guarantee that it's going to be beneficial, right? And so plasticity is just the ability to be molded, and how that's molded is up to you. And so being really cognizant of what you're doing and who you're around is essential afterwards. And if anything, this is a good practice because our environment is affecting us all the time, and any action, there's no neutral action. You're either encoding something positive or something negative. And so just bringing that deeper level of awareness, regardless, is so essential.
Yeah, I think this
Yeah.
is so important to communicate to partners, or if anyone's watching this and their partner just did a psychedelic session. I think partners who are not in the session often feel left out, and like their partner has gone and had this adventure journey without them, and there can be like some resentment or feeling confused or lonely, and it's really important to create a space to support the person who just had a psychedelic session, instead of getting caught up in all of their feelings and kind of bringing that to the table. So they also need support, people who don't go through the psychedelic session, and it's so important to integrate together.
Yeah.
Definitely. And I think I know some organizations thinking about that, like proactively, what is the integration protocol for the partner, for the family, for the people they live
Right.
with? And what you're speaking to is so important. And it's like the community embedding of the experience is essential. And we're learning that more and more.
Absolutely. This is something that I think makes it very difficult to practice really good psychedelic therapy in the US. We had a lot of experiences working with clients who are like, I literally cannot take enough time off of work to do the preparation and the integration needed to support this psychedelic session. I do not have anybody to help me with my childcare. I do not have the support and the structure of a community who can hold me through this process, right? And like that is such an indication of our, I mean, it's a I think a broader criticism of our culture, which is that people don't have enough support to be able to do this kind of healing work a lot of the time, right? And like this is not something that you can just squeeze in on your lunch break and then go right back to your life. You need to be able to in like have the support that you can really invest in this. And I do love working with couples from this perspective because then at least you have your partner, right? Your romantic partner that often you're living with, um, who can show up for you and with you in this space and, be again supported in their own way, whether or not they're, couples are journeying together or whether, one partner is just sort of there as a support and an integration partner. Being able to have the loved one present and involved in the work is so helpful for creating that kind of supportive community, but it's not a substitute for like a broader community, and we really I think it's such a sign that we need to be investing more in that as a culture.
Definitely. I mean, maybe you're the same, but we live in kind of these bubbles where this kind of talk of healing and community support is normalized. This is not the case so much, right? And I think about that a lot. It's how to create these safe spaces, these community containers. And these days, a lot of cities in North America, at least, and in Europe actually, have psychedelic communities of some kind that are hosting integration circles. And of course, quality of facilitation can vary, quality of people there can vary, but often these groups are coming from a really good place of offering the support. And I hope, as psychedelics enter more into the mainstream and as psilocybin gets through the FDA, which it very likely will by the end of next year, that these kinds of discussions will be normalized because we know that psychedelics can't just be crammed into existing healthcare systems. We need all sorts of changes to accommodate them, the types of experiences and mechanisms. And so let's hope this will feed out into the culture and normalize the idea of processing feelings vulnerably in a group, within families and communities. And I think a lot of the young people are into this a lot more than older generations. I think like the Gen Zs and lower and younger are just naturally more self-aware and inclined towards this kind of thing. But we got to get through to the older generations too, for sure.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the younger generations are seeing very clearly the failure of our focus on just the nuclear family system at the expense of any other kind of community system, right? Like that's just
Hmm.
not it's not serving us anymore, and it's really clear how that's not. And so yeah, I'm hopeful that we can continue to build more kind of intentionally build more community around this for healing.
I'm curious, before we hopped on the call before we went live, you were talking about some of the kind of retreats that you've done with men and women. We didn't get to dive into it too much, but I'm curious, what are you seeing in those spaces that's standing out to you that is important?
For me, yeah, I mean, particularly working with men, I've led a men's work circle for many years and done retreats, as you mentioned. And the core thing, and this is probably no surprise to anybody, for a lot of men is just opening up into vulnerability and being okay being seen in that way and overcoming shame. There's a lot of shame amongst men these days about just anything, whether it's being emotional or, being scared of being canceled and being walking on eggshells and being denying different aspects of themselves and just kind of losing direction. And for me, it comes back, I think a main thing that blocks men is feeling safe to be humble, to be vulnerable. They often feel like, oh, I have to have it together, otherwise my girlfriend's not going to be attracted to me, or I'm going to be rejected, or I'm going to be hit while I'm down, kind of thing. And so I think, with psychedelics too, it helps us see vulnerability as a strength. It helps us to go into those deep, dark corners and see that through it we get stronger, we become more self-aware, our ability to be integrated and embodied is increased, and how we show up in our relationships is different, and how people respond to us starts to change. And I've seen this happen with multiple men, even just without medicine, just in these containers that we create, that create a safe space for this. There's a huge, huge demand for it, and people just don't know where to go. And I think, and even when they do, it takes months, to open up and feel safe.
Yeah.
We often talk about safety as something, with women not feeling safe around men, or just the importance of safety to relaxing, you have your nervous system regulated. But a lot of men just don't feel safe either, and they don't,
Totally.
they're the last to admit that, right? And so creating safe spaces for men, medicine or otherwise, I think is essential. And again, the way that psychedelics are framed and the way that you go into the ketamine experience or psilocybin, you're really there as if it's your first time, like a child, right? You're like, oh, I don't quite know what's going to happen. I'm a bit trepidatious, but I heard this and this. Tell me what I need to do. And like, you have to handhold them through it. And that itself is such a vulnerability, right? And then having the profound experience of opening, like all that is so beautiful and is so needed. And all my work outside of psychedelics affirms that too.
Absolutely. It's so relevant to like I'm really thinking about so many couples that I've worked with. Like I think that this idea of particularly for men, right? Because, in the US, we don't raise men to really have the priority or the skill set by and large to value their interpersonal connections with other men, right? In the same way that women are raised to have the skill set and the value priority, right? To have interpersonal relationships with other women. And this is such a disservice to men and boys. And so often what will happen is a couple will land in couple therapy, and particularly if couple therapy is helpful, right? Then he is able to learn how to open up and be vulnerable, but only with his partner, only with his wife, right? Only with her. And then she becomes like the entire like center of his emotional safety. And that's not
Right.
sustainable. That's
No.
not good for either of them. It's not sustainable. And so, so often what feels so important is for them to both be able to have support outside of that, and the experience of getting to be vulnerable with other men, like in particular,
Mhm.
right, is so valuable and so important and like such needed work.
Yeah, we really need more spaces where men are loving men and caring for men. I'm working with, this is a little bit different, but this is bringing this up for me. We work with a lot of non-monogamous couples in our practice, and I'm working with two couples right now that are opening. Um, a bisexual couple, two women, and a het couple. And the man in the het couple said, I'm fine with opening, but only with women, no men. We can be with women, she can be with women, I can be with women, but no men. And then I was working with my bisexual couple, two women, and they're like, yeah, like one of them was like, I'm, fine opening, but like, I don't want her with any men. Women are fine, but no men. And I'm like, you're both bisexual. Like, what is happening here? That like men are not okay with men, women are not okay with men. Like, we got to get our men together and like start loving each other and feel safe with each other. Because like, if no one wants any man near their relationship, even if they're attracted to men, like, what is happening?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I mean, at the same time, it doesn't surprise me too much. This is kind of normalized at this point. But you're very right. It does not need to be like that, right? And I think it does come back to this. It's safety and ability to be emotionally vulnerable and trust, right? Because vulnerability,
Yeah.
of course, creates trust, creates connection, creates intimacy, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you cut off that at any point in there, you're not gonna feel comfortable. You're not gonna trust the intentions. You're not gonna be able to relax. But I think, yeah, men want these things. I'm a firm believer men want to deepen in their intimacy and want to feel more connected and want to
Of
open up.
course.
But they just don't know how to do that and have all sorts of fears around it, right? And so, yeah, I think these men's groups, men's communities, like one of the big ones that I'm increasingly a part of, it's called Sacred Sons. So all the dudes listening to this should check out Sacred Sons. They have amazing events all over North America and Europe. And it's really about men supporting other men in their own process, relationally, also professionally, personally, spiritually as well. And, I'm embedded in communities where this is increasingly normalized. A lot of my friends are coaches for men in some respect and hold containers and retreats. And this is the milieu I'm in. But if you're outside of that, it's quite foreign, and you might have the only relationships that you have with men are playing video games or sports or watching sports or drinking and going to the bar, and where nobody's saying that deeper thing, like, oh,
Yeah.
like I'm feeling, I don't know, a lot of fear around my financial future right now. My partner depends on me. I'm not sure what to do. Like, what do you recommend? Like, that for me is a very normal conversation, right? For a lot of people, they're like, hell no, I would never say that. Like, I'm gonna get made fun of, I'm gonna get roasted for it. And so, yeah, but I do think it's changing, and these subcultures are expanding. It's just about continuing to do the work.
There's one couple that we're working with in the practice now where that exact, if the husband and this couple could have had that exact conversation with somebody, it would have prevented him from having an affair and
Yeah.
would have prevented all of these downstream kind of chaotic effects that are as a result of that. But it's because he didn't like have the capacity or the opportunity, the structure to be able to be vulnerable with kind of peers around that. So yeah, hugely important. I want to be clear too. I just wanted to make a mention for anybody watching that, like, in no way, I think when I talk about this a lot, when I talk about sort of the way that men are socialized and women are socialized, in no way does this like discount the experience of trans folks and non-binary folks, right? I think it's just really important to acknowledge that we do culturally have different ways of raising and socializing people who are raised as women and people who are raised as men, right? And like that shapes us for sure. I have a lot of friends who are non-binary, and so we're well aware that there's lots of people who don't fit within this sort of binary, and the binary itself is a construct, right? And yet it really does shape our lives in some powerful ways.
Yeah, and I could say in the circles I've led and been a part of, we've had trans people, non-binary, gay people, like, you know, we've, yeah, it's inclusive of all of that for sure.
Um, to go a little bit of a different direction, I was looking at your website and I was seeing, which we also talked with Leo a little bit about, but these like engineered non-psychedelic psychedelics. So, what does it mean to separate the psychedelic experience, the subjective experience, from the psychedelic? What is this?
Well, yeah, well, the framing is a bit confusing the way you said it, but like really what it is in the end is like, okay, we think about psychedelics and their effects. If we just completely simplify, there are two different components of that. One is the psychedelic experience slash subjective effects slash psychological effects, and the other is effects on the brain and the body. And a lot of those are, you know, interrelated and aren't dissociable, but seemingly and surprisingly, some are. And particularly, there's been drugs developed that seem to be able to induce neuroplasticity and have really strong anti-inflammatory effects in the brain and the body without making people trip. And so, and then the idea is that, oh, like a lot of conditions, whether it's psychiatric conditions, you know, depression, anxiety, substance use, PTSD, or neurological conditions, you know, including like brain injuries, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, MS, all these things are characterized by impaired neuroplasticity and brain inflammation. So if you have a drug that increases neuroplasticity and reduces inflammation, amazing, right? And the idea is that if we don't have the trip, it's much more easy to take it. A lot of people, it's much more accessible. Doesn't require, you know, 4 to 6 hours with a therapist, which can be costly, and who knows how insurance is going to cover that in the future. And so this is a more scalable, accessible alternative that is, again, an improvement over existing medications, you know, 99% of the time, with a better side effect profile, et cetera. And so we need to be, you know, pursuing that path. I don't think it's going to replace psychedelics. I think it's a complement. It's an alternative. And so yeah, that space is moving really fast. My company that I'm running, CEO and co-founder of, we're designing non-hallucinogenic analogs for particularly Parkinson's and a subdisorder of Parkinson's called L-DOPA-induced dyskinesia. And the idea there is like, yeah, these neurological things, like it's all connected, but I feel like they rely less on us processing our relationships and emotions and more on us just fixing our brain, right? And helping heal the brain. And so, yeah, that's something I'm excited about these days.
That makes a lot of sense.
So rock paper scissors short. I think that's really exciting, especially when I think about. I have been wondering for a really long time, like, when am I going to start hearing more about the power of psychedelics for things like traumatic brain injury and Parkinson's and dementia and things, right? Where neurogenesis clearly is like going to be so helpful, right? One would think. So that seems amazing. And I understand and am on board with everything that you just said. And can I tell you my fear? And then maybe you can help me worry less about this. I think my fear is that when I hear about, particularly in the United States, again, I'm sorry, my cat is going insane in the background. when I hear in the United States, in given our legacy of the drug war, given our legacy of a real rejection and fear of any kind of mood altering or mind altering substance, right? With notable exception of alcohol, which for some reason we freaking love. My fear is that I see a lot of these sort of commercial efforts to produce like the benefits without giving people any kind of pleasure or joy or euphoria, right? Because we have this puritanical, I think, like vestige of like really kind of viewing those things as sinful, as bad, as wrong, right? And so my fear is that we're moving in a direction where we want to kind of divorce like the like full spectrum of human experience kind of from these medicines. So I'm curious what you think about that idea and like how we might avoid that pitfall.
Yeah, it's a good point. And, originally when I heard the concept of non-psychedelic psychedelics, it's like, of course, they're just going to take all the fun out of it and remove anything that's new and threatening and just stick with what you know of like a typical form of model drug, right? And so I totally get it. And yeah, this is why I really emphasize these things are, I think, parallel to each other and complementary. That, just by the nature of money and existing healthcare pharma structures, they're going to try this, right? And they're going to pursue it, and people are going to put money into it. And so I think, at the same time, I think psychedelics, like psychedelics proper, are helping advance the idea that, yeah, our experiences do matter and we need to process our stuff, right? We have to work through emotions. We have to do the hard work of having insight and looking at ourselves honestly. And I think that in parallel is gaining in awareness too. And so I think it's going to be this kind of bifurcation almost, where there's like a whole class of approaches where it's like, yes, subjective experience, spiritual connectedness, emotional catharsis, insight. And then there's the whole class of, I just want something to feel better. I don't have to do anything, and I think, that's going to be outmoded eventually. But with these non-psychedelic psychedelics too, I think I wouldn't say you just take them and you magically get better and you don't need to do anything. I feel like they're amplifiers that synergize with other things you're doing in your life to increase the pace of change. And that's the neuroplastic component, right? And so it's still not in the same model of an SSRI where you're just told to just take it and not told to do anything with it. Even though there's evidence, plenty of evidence suggesting that your environment really matters for the SSRI's effect too. Like it's not just a purely pharmacological treatment. Probably every drug is like that, but it's being downplayed by biomedical psychiatry. But I think, yeah, so I hear your concern, and I think both tracks are moving forward, and there's always going to be people who are more called to one or the other.
That's so true about SSRIs. And if anybody's listening, if you were prescribed an SSRI, an antidepressant medication for depression or anxiety, the gold standard, like the actual first line treatment, is that plus therapy. So you should be getting therapy also. If you're not doing some kind of cognitive behavioral therapy along with your SSRI, you are not getting the full treatment, as was designed. So I totally agree with that. I'm curious if I know the research on microdosing is, I think it's generous to call it mixed. I think we're struggling to find kind of a signal that microdosing does much. That might be a failure of how we're designing the studies, but I'm curious if you suspect that as we learn more and more about microdosing, do you think that is likely to have a kind of similar potentiating effect, or do you think that mostly we need to be kind of looking at other routes?
Yeah, it's still an open question. There are some studies that have found effects greater than placebo with microdosing, and but not consistently. And I also think microdosing, I mean, in terms of biology and biological effects, there is evidence suggesting it probably does increase neuroplasticity to an extent. And whether that's clinically meaningful and it's actually going to make, meaningful change is another question. But I think the future of microdosing, if it is to have a meaningful effect, is combining it with things similar to what we're just talking about. I think it could be an amplifier of existing practices. And people ask me, oh, non-hallucinogenic psychedelics, that's just microdosing, right? But it is quite different because now there's a cat here. I don't know if you can hear mine meowing on my side.
Just
Talk
cats
to each
everywhere.
other.
Yeah, exactly. The thing with microdosing is you're taking a small dose, so you're doing what psilocybin does, let's say, but at a fraction of the amount. And so it's like a really, obviously a low dose. Whereas with these non-psychedelic versions, you're still getting a high dose. It's just there's a cap, a peak on, or a ceiling where it can't go beyond that, which is different. And so I think just, to put it out there, like non-psychedelic psychedelics are very different than microdosing. But I wouldn't just throw microdosing out yet. A lot of people benefit immensely from it, and whether that's, even if that's like 70% placebo, I mean, they're getting better as long as it's not causing harm. That's the main thing. And so I'm not opposed to people microdosing and pursuing that. There's, a lot more to be done with the science in terms of studying it. And so I just like to remain open-minded to it.
What do you think about microdosing ketamine?
That's an interesting one. I mean, that just makes me think of people at Burning Man or at raves or any party these days. I
Have you
don't
heard
know,
of
actually.
have you heard
I
of
haven't.
Joyous, the companies that are now creating ketamine microdosing?
Oh, I didn't know that was a
Daily
thing.
use microdosed ketamine is the
You know, I think, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I definitely know people who are doing it and not in a good way, and that's the thing with ketamine. As you both know, I'm sure it has more addictive potential. I think it's anxiolytic and analgesic, like pain relieving effects, especially with somebody who suffers from anxiety and chronic pain. It could be habit forming very fast, and it could be a self-medicating tendency, and all of this, and not to mention the potential effects on our bladder and urinary tract. It does cause inflammation and cause damage to our kind of endothelial lining inside of our urinary tract, which even at lower doses, it doesn't need to be an insane amount. And so I personally would have a lot of caution around that. Just knowing a lot of, not a lot, but like several very high functioning, great people who thought they were immune to being addicted to ketamine and it happening and having a tough time with it. So, obviously the clinical use, the way you guys do it is, much, much different than that. It's not, a daily use model. I find that to be a bit risky for sure.
same. I did not love hearing about that when I first heard about it. We're probably going to get some nasty emails from Joyce's lawyers after this, but whatever. I I think that part of the guidance that I tend to give people is one, think about if you are sort of using something daily, right? Is that having the function of allowing you to engage more fully with your life and with your emotional experience and with being in the world, or is that something that is allowing you to escape and avoid being more present, right? Because as soon as we start using something daily that's allowing us to avoid, whether it's physiologically addictive or not, right, that can be psychologically problematic. I'm deeply skeptical of anxiolytic meds in general. I mean, I think as a clinical psychologist who treats anxiety disorders, like benzos are the bane of my existence. I want them off this planet. They're not
Mm-hmm.
helpful. They backfire and they prevent us from doing the work that we need to do to like actually feel more fully and be in our bodies and in our lives. So I that's my worry with ketamine is that it's going to kind of go down that route.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, just to, if I can add, I think this is an important point. Just like comparing it to psilocybin microdosing. It's like, oh, why are we pro psilocybin microdosing, not ketamine? Beyond the addictive potential, I think it's what you just said. I think psilocybin, even at microdosing, or even in lower doses, like say 200 milligrams of mushrooms or something, they make people more emotional. They connect you with your emotions and your body, right? Whereas ketamine is designated as a dissociative, and it kind of helps you almost like float above your body, so to speak, and so you're less, so it's more of an avoidance, especially if done on a regular basis, right? And so I totally agree with that. It's very different than microdosing a psychedelic, like a classic psychedelic.
And just so people are kind of aware of how ketamine is used differently in a therapeutic context, um, and specifically with couples. So, in couple therapy, we're going to go through the assessment, we're going to develop a conceptualization of what's happening in your relationship, where you're getting stuck, what patterns are coming up. And then we may only do one medicine session, and because ketamine is a dissociative, it kind of pulls you out of that pattern and you can see it from a different space. You have more flexibility in your thinking, more openness. And that may be kind of a big enough shift to then move into integration and couple therapy and make all of the changes that we kind of set out to make at the beginning. And so it's clearly very different than a daily kind of microdosing model.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it in that way, the fact that it is a dissociative allows us, in kind of the same ways we were talking earlier with MDMA and as well as the classic psychedelics, in the way that those sort of increase capacity for feeling our feelings in a way that's going to help us heal, right? When we're using ketamine in this way, despite the fact that it's a dissociative, it kind of puts us in this observer perspective and allows us to really see what's going on and really take ownership of our own feelings and discover the more vulnerable feelings that are underneath the more defended emotions, right? And kind of have a lot of insights and a lot of like felt awareness. People tend to really feel that in their body, and that, and then be able to take that into their lives. And when you do this in the context of couples work, then we're using it to engage more with those, right? So the temporary dissociation actually gives us more access to something that otherwise we're kind of blocked from. And that is super different than dissociating as a way of coping with the feelings on an ongoing basis.
I'm aware of time, and if there is anyone that has any questions, Kayla, can you see it? Are you in the? If
I
anyone does
am.
have
No,
any
no questions
questions,
have come through. Yeah.
okay. Um, we'll just open that up if people do. We have a couple more minutes.
Can I add something if we're a little
Of
low here?
course.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think, a common theme here in what we're talking about and what psychedelics allow, I think that's important, is moving from avoidance to approach, right? With respect to emotions, with respect to difficult feelings. And in my experience, again, the way to, however you want to say it, heal, grow, expand, progress in your own journey, is by feeling, right? Everyone says, oh yeah, feel your feelings. It's kind of a cliche, but it's very true. And often our thought processes and projections and blame and all of that is an inability to sit with our own difficult feelings. And, you know, allowing yourself to go out of the mind into the body, feeling that, and just creating a container for it, and creating space for it to move through you, is usually what will save months, years, maybe decades of rumination and spiraling and circular thought patterns. And you guys made a good point about the window of tolerance. Sometimes it's too intense to go inside. I'm a big meditator, and I've been growing increasingly aware that not everyone's ready to meditate. If you've had some complex trauma and your body's dysregulated, meditation can produce a panic attack. It can produce the mental destabilization. So not everyone's ready for it, but as you said, like MDMA, and I believe also ketamine, psilocybin can expand our capacity to hold these emotions in without overwhelm. And this is why MDMA is so effective for PTSD. And so it's really, for me, it's like a matter of how to get yourself in as regulated of a state as possible in order to just like go inside and really feel it. This is for men too, because a lot of men are just, especially ones who are like me, who are like more intellectual, cognitive. We just live up here because it's safe, it's easy. And for me personally, like, sure, I could talk circles around my trauma and my patterns, but that doesn't do anything in the end. I think that's not enough. You have to really feel and express and go in the body. And I think psychedelics can be powerful catalysts for that. And I think people don't talk enough about the somatic dimensions of psychedelics as well. People, with ketamine more and more, but if you look at the research literature or just these clinical trials, the body is an afterthought. It's all about beliefs and perspectives and insights and cognition. And I think really a lot of movement happens somatically, expressively, emotionally. And so I think that for me is the through line here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and often like you can see it on psychedelics, like what is happening in the body. Like a lot of times in ketamine sessions or MDMA sessions, like we'll actually see people shaking or like pushing, and so being able to have the ability to go into those spaces with our patients or people that we're working with, if we're not able to do that, it's right, a huge missed opportunity for healing. Thank you so much for joining us today. This conversation was really fun.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's fun. This is different than my usual conversation, so happy to do this again whenever.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us, everyone.